Hello, American history students. This is a presentation on American slaves, on American slavery. So we'll look a little bit about how human societies organized with slavery, how societies set up what we call stratified societies, and we'll take a look at how slavery helped to define what America was in the early to mid 19th century. So we're looking like late 1830s to around 1850. You should have already done your reading that was assigned earlier, and you'll need to have your notes that are on Google Classroom to follow this presentation. I'll go a little bit on the fast side. What I mean is you'll need to stop this presentation from time to time so you can put your notes in. Okay, so one of the things you need to understand, and this is the first thing of your notes, is I want you to connect to some things that you know about these questions and some things that are mystery. As you approach new learning, you're always going to look at things that you already know. So let's take a look at this. So we're going to look at what is the meaning and significance of race. What is the meaning and significance of stratification? What are labor systems and how are they important in society? How did race develop into the basis of social stratification? And how did slavery become the foundation for America's growing economy? From the reading, you probably already know America had slavery. You probably knew that before. Most Americans do, even though it seems kind of hard to believe at a time in our history that that was happening. So think of other things that you may already know and look at these questions and think of things that might be strange. Okay, stop the presentation and take a look and then get back started when you're done. You notice that your notes have person A and person B. That's because you can, if you choose to, take a copy of your notes and then make a copy of it and share it with somebody as an editor, and then you can work on it together. If that's not possible for you, then you only need to fill out person A on the note sheet. Okay, so our question in part one looks at status and stratification. You have a question is, how is race an imaginary and superficial divider of people? Race is really a cultural rather than a biological category, meaning that it's no different than a blonde from a brunette. It's something that's superficial that has adapted over time. But there's no significant biological differences between races, between black and white and Asian. Racial differences had emerged as humans left Africa about 80,000 years ago, that all humans are rooted into a species that left Africa about 80,000 years ago. So we're all African Americans, if you really want to get down to it. But as people settled different parts of the planet, they began to adapt to the different types of climate in many ways, and some of them were slightly biological. But the differences were really relatively imaginary. Now, there's a video, How is Race Imaginary? I'd like you to watch that video before we move on to the next slide. But even though race is imaginary, and the movie will say this, race has been given significant meaning because the way that it divides people. And through American history, we know that in the period of 1850, your color could determine whether you were able to be sold as a piece of property. So we'll be looking at that. So stop the slide, watch the video on how race is imaginary, and then take a look at how is race imaginary in a superficial divider. Questions 4, 5, and 6 deal with the issue of social stratification you'll see in this slide. You want to get this definition. Social stratification is a system by which different people are given different amounts of power, prestige, and wealth in society, known as status. You notice that some people are very rich and powerful or are given great esteem. Think of, for example, a rock star or an entrepreneur, that somewhere along the line, or a doctor, these people were held in high esteem. Other people, much less so. Although in our society we're all equal under the law, a rich man like Jeff Bezos, for example, doesn't have a right to kill a poor homeless person. But the point is that there are different amounts of power, prestige, and wealth. And this is an old feature in history, that from the earliest civilizations, there were, kings and warriors and aristocrats and landholders. And then the lower classes generally were farmers, and at the very bottom were slaves. And slaves are a feature of stratification. Okay, so the question is stratification, how does it drive inequality? Different levels in society have different access to resources. So, for example, if you're a multimillionaire, you have access, for example, to nice neighborhoods, access to plenty of high quality goods. And if you're relatively poor, you don't have access to that. So there's different levels of access to resources. As I mentioned, as all Americans are equal under the eyes of the law, you're not equal in the marketplace. But there's other issues besides economics. You know, there are people, for example, who might not be very highly paid, say, for example, a minister or a priest, who is esteemed in the community, but doesn't have the material power, say, for example, as someone who might do more remunerated work. Occupation, gender, and wealth have significant influence on our opportunities and the way we're viewed by others. So it's not just about your occupation. Historically, being a woman or a man would give you or deny you opportunities to achieve in our society. And we also know that race has been and race continues to be a defining issue of social stratification. We know that in the period we're looking at in the 1850s, it was a necessary condition, being black, as to being a slave. There were no white slaves. American history is full of movements by which people who are locked into certain lower statuses work to fight them. Women fought for more power and rights in a number of waves in the women's rights movement. And we looked at a number of waves in the civil rights movement too, where we're talking about maybe Mexicans or the elderly or the handicapped, or going into, we're looking at here African Americans. But stratification is a result of complex societies with you have a lot of different needs for a lot of different work. For example, we know that some people, we need people working in fast food restaurants, we need people working in grocery stores, and we need doctors, we need engineers. And all of those things have different levels of status. And those things that bring status will drive people to different places to where the opportunities and where their skill sets fit. Okay, you can stop the slide right now. Next, we're going to look at labor systems and stratification. We're looking at how the idea of having different levels in society serves the needs where people are able to produce and exchange goods and services. That certainly is going to be an issue when we talk about slavery, where slavery is a status, a very low status, but a very necessary one for America's economy in the 1850s, particularly in the South. Human societies over history have developed different strategies of organizing labor. How do you get people to gather crops? How do you get people to work in the mines? How do you get people to do undesirable work? How do you get people to take risks and organize wealth? These are all things that are as old as the economy. Our modern economy primarily uses wage labor to meet our needs. So, for example, I go as a teacher and I've had to prepare myself for that. I had to agree to a wage that teachers get paid, and I convert my wages to meet the needs of my family. And your families do the same thing. So that's how most of our labor gets. We don't have people, with the exceptions of prison conscripted labor, we don't have large amounts of labor that come from force. There's a couple of exceptions, like being a parent does not generally pay, and they provide very important services, you know, taking care of the house and managing families. But if you volunteer and you work in some organization, and you say you clean up a churchyard or something of that nature, that's not labor that comes from a wage. But generally speaking, most of labor that gets done in our society is done when people exchange their time and skill set for labor. But we know that widespread forced labor, that is people who did labor, human beings who did labor by force, not by wage, was once legal in the United States. Questions 7 and 8 really force you to really think about the value of labor systems and what they do. Why does a society need a labor system? Think of the products that you need to live the life the way you do, and all the efforts and all the labor it takes to be produced. Why does a society have to figure out ways by which people will take their skill sets and their time and effort and convert those things into useful products? Because none of us produce everything we need. How does a labor system do that? That's question number 7. Now, question 8 requires a little bit of inference too. We have stratification in our system of labor. There's some labor that's highly prestigious. You think, for example, maybe of a surgeon. Some services or some labor, like working as an entrepreneur, might provide a high degree of material wealth. For example, think of the Amazon and Jeff Bezos. And some labor is relatively difficult and undesirable. Maybe think, for example, of people who collect garbage. How do you get people to do that work? Or why would a person sacrifice and go 4 years or 8 years to college to work on and develop some kind of a skill set? How does the labor system kind of drive and provide for the needs of our society? How does it drive individuals like you to think about what sacrifices they're willing to make so they can become part of the labor system? How does stratification work there? Think about that for a moment and stop the slide. Our modern labor system gives us a lot of individuals, a lot of, I guess you could say, opportunity to think and decide what we want to do and what efforts we're willing to take. And perhaps a higher status might be driving that. And those are the questions that we've looked at. Now, the labor system that we know as slavery, though, offers really almost no choice for those who are providing the labor as slaves. How did slavery come to be in American history? We'll look at question number 10 and question number 11. European settlers, when they came to the Americas, starting in the early 16th century, in the 1500s, there was land and opportunity, but little labor to convert the land into useful economic gain. It was actually the sugar industry that really requires lots of very difficult labor, and Europeans were unwilling to do a lot of that work. So first, the American Indians were conscripted as slaves, but generally speaking, were susceptible to European diseases, or they could run away, and they were certainly in their home territory and would find ways to kind of disappear from European settlement. Well, the African slave trade had existed for a long time, and Europeans tapped into that early on islands in the Atlantic. They would use as sugar plantations, and they just simply expanded and attached themselves to that marketplace, buying African slaves to take care of the really labor-intensive pre-industrial agriculture. It was sugar, then came things like tobacco, and what we're really interested in here when we get into the early 19th century is cotton. American Indians could not or would not serve in most places, and there was typically really bad labor shortages. So African slavery, which had existed for a long time, became a source for labor. Slaves who were purchased eventually would become the perpetual property, meaning just like a tractor or any kind of implement that you use to perform labor, it gets passed on from father to son. But unlike tractors, people replicate, have children, and the children become the property of the children of the slave owners. It becomes perpetual ownership.